We started last week into a series that I'm calling Discipleship 101. We'll be looking between now and end of June or so at some of the interactions Jesus has with his disciples. And if you have your Bible, I'm going to invite you to put your thumb in it or your finger in at Mark chapter 6. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Last week, if you were here or you heard online, you might recall that I said that I was willing to bet that I am not the only person, or was not the only person in the room whose decision to follow Christ was influenced by any number of people other than a pastor or a preacher. Now, that is not to say that pastors and preachers were unimportant, but there were a lot of people who had a hand in either enabling me to come to Christ in the first place or then to live into that commitment. One of the things I remember about my at home is I remember my mom at the kitchen table doing Bible study and being part of a series of studies that were at church. Those are kind of a neutral memory. There's another memory that, if I'm honest, is probably not the best memory, but it's an important memory. And that is at certain points where I said, well, Mom, I really don't want to go to church this morning. Or I'm not really so sure about this confirmation thing or whatever. It's like, we go to church on Sunday morning. And that was it. That settled it. I have memories of my folks, those and others. But then there were others, like Gladys Freiling. Some of you know Gladys or knew Gladys Freiling. Gladys was a 7th grade Bible teacher at Minnehaha Academy, and she had us 7th graders studying the book of Romans. That's a hard book for adults to study, but she had us doing it in 7th grade. But then there were junior high and senior high friends. People like Todd Nelson, Dave Swinson, Chris Rosedal, Debbie Jo Nelson, to name just a few. Again, it's not that my pastors like Bud Bond and Gordon Bergine were unimportant. They were very important, but there were so many others, including my peers, who encouraged me and helped me make that decision to follow Christ. And I will say that I am able to stand here today, not as a pastor, but just as a disciple, because of them. And I'm thankful for them. And I know that I am not alone in that kind of experience. What's our tagline here at Maple Grove Covenant Church? 3 words. Go, love, live. What is the first of those 3 words? Go. Go. It's pretty much what Jesus had in mind, the whole 3 words, but they're all part of what Jesus had in mind when he called those first 12 disciples. And last week we talked about 2 specific purposes that Jesus had in calling them. One was, first of all, that they would be with him, that they would learn from him, that they would be mentored by him. But the second was to represent him to people whom Jesus himself would never influence directly. They were to be his hands and feet, his voices to others. And that's what we pick up on today. It's the go of go, love, live. Before we do that, though, let's turn to Mark 6, or if you've got your finger there, open up to Mark 6. And I'm going to read beginning the latter part of verse 6 on through 13 and then verse 30. Mark writes this. Then Jesus went around teaching from village to village, and calling the 12 to him, he sent them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over evil spirits. These were his instructions. Take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in your belts. Wear sandals, but not an extra tunic. Whenever you go inside a house, stay there until you leave that town. And if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, shake the dust off your feet when you leave as a testimony against them. They went out and preached that people should repent. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. And then verse 30. The apostles gathered back around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. In front of us this morning is the Lord's table. Looks familiar to us. We share this meal at least typically once a month here. One of the things that you may have picked up that I will say, hopefully pretty regularly, but it's something that really goes throughout our history as a denomination, is something to this effect. That you don't need to be a member of a covenant church, you don't need to be a member of this church to participate in the Lord's Supper. We only ask that you truly desire to follow Jesus Christ. That's something that comes to us from the early, that attitude is something that comes to us from the early days of our movement. One of the significant events in what I call the prehistory of the covenant was something called the Uppsala communion controversy. Now we're talking Uppsala, Sweden, not Uppsala, Minnesota. There have probably been some communion controversies in Uppsala, Minnesota too, but that's not what I'm talking about. It arose because there was a concern among those early people who became the covenanters, those mission friends, over the fact that communion in the state church was being taken pretty casually. It was often led, frankly, by priests, and that's what they call Lutheran pastors in Sweden. They're priests. It was led by priests who, frankly, didn't know Jesus themselves. And the people who came to take communion often really had no real desire to follow Jesus themselves. And to our covenant founders, that was just not right. And so there was a special service in Uppsala led by a pastor named Paul Peter Waldenström, which was by invitation only. You had to be a believer to participate, because there was this understanding that this meal is for God's people, for followers of Jesus. That ran awry of the state church leaders, but they went ahead with it. And that's why we say you don't need to be a member of this church, you don't need to be a member of a covenant church, but we do ask that you sincerely desire to follow Jesus, because this meal is for God's people. Having said that, this table is not just for us. It is not just for us. It is also for those who will join us, I hope, in the future. And I'm not talking here about Christians who come from one church to this church for one reason or another. I am talking about people who do not yet know Jesus, but who will come to know him through us and will join us at this table for this meal. This is a family meal. But it's a meal with lots of empty chairs around. I'm not saying that because there's space in the pews. I'm saying it because there's always room. There's always room for another follower of Jesus, a new follower of Jesus. You and I am here at this table because of people like Gladys Freiling and Todd Nelson and Debbie Jo Dieter and Chris Rosedal and Dave Swenson and others. You are at this table because of a different set of names of people who have influenced you. And the question I would put to us is, who might be at this table in the future because of your influence on them? With that, coming back to Mark 6, as Jesus sends them out, he gives them some things, and I would say he gives us some things through them each of which is central to his purpose of bringing a lost, hurting, and broken world back to himself, each of which is central to our own ability to influence others with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm going to hit 3 of them very briefly, then spend a little more time on the 4th. The first one simply is responsibility. Verse 7, Jesus sends them out to preach. And of course, that's what Mark tells us he was going to do back in chapter 3, the passage that we looked at last week. He actually sends them out to preach. They've been with Jesus. They've been learning from him. They've been being mentored by him, and now it's as if he's pushing them out of the nest. And of course, what happens when a bird gets pushed out of the nest? I mean, they have to fly. So there's a sense in which that's what's happening here. Jesus is finally saying, okay, time for you to get out there and go about what I have for you. Last week I said that when you've been with Jesus, you can't hide it. One way or another, it's going to come out. If we do try to hide it, then we've got some issues. But there's a sense in which when we've been with Jesus, we can't hide it. People are going to see it one way or another. And sometimes that might mean that it feels like we've been pushed out of the net or out of the nest because we're in a situation where I have to fly. But you know what? That's part of God's purpose for us. That's part of our responsibility. In one way or another, it's to point people to Jesus. Sometimes in what we say, hopefully all the times in how we live and speak and carry ourselves. But it's part of being a disciple. Second thing is authority. We've talked before in different contexts a little bit about the nature of authority. Authority is not something we take. It's not something that we have inherently in ourselves. Authority is something that we are granted. And here, Jesus grants authority to the disciples. Now, in verse 7, Mark mentions specifically authority over demons. Verse 13, when we get there, we see that they did in fact cast out demons. We also see that they healed and they anointed. There's a sense in which the disciples were basically about the same kinds of things that Jesus was about. But they weren't doing it on their own. They were doing it because they had been authorized. They had been sent to do it. Now, when we read this passage, it raises questions. Okay, well, what about exorcisms? What about healing and all those kinds of things? And do we still see those today or do we not see them? That's a topic for another time. What I want to point out, though, is that along with that responsibility to influence others for Christ comes the authority to do it, and as we see elsewhere, the power to do it because of the Holy Spirit. We have the same ability to demonstrate life shaped and influenced by Jesus. We have the same authority the disciples did, and that's an authority and a responsibility that we need to live into. There's a third thing, though, probably more by implication than anything, and that is freedom. And by freedom, I mean a couple of things. First, and this is going a little bit beyond the passage, but I think it's important. It's the freedom to do what we can when we can. Think back to the people who have influenced you to follow Jesus, or the people that influenced me. Each one of them had kind of their own little part in that process. And oftentimes what we can do to point someone to Jesus isn't going to get them over the finish line, but it will hopefully move them closer. I've more than once heard of folks who have had the experience of leading someone to Christ, of praying with them when they came to follow Jesus, but it was after a whole lot of other people had talked to them and prayed for them and encouraged them along the way, and they're just the ones who got to be there when the decision was finally made. And if you've ever been there, you know that's a thrill. But that does not discount the work that others did along the way to model Christ-likeness, to speak of their experience with Jesus and to point them to the gospel. The second thing of freedom, though, is the freedom to leave the results to God. Book of Acts, Lydia's conversion. Luke tells us that it was the Lord who opened Lydia's heart to receive the message. Verse 11 here makes it clear that not everyone is going to respond to the gospel. Not everyone is going to respond to Jesus the way we would hope that they will. Now, again, if we had more time, we could try to unpack what's the symbolism here of shaking the dust off your feet. It's not an unimportant question, but it's not where I want to go this morning. What I want to point out is that, as Luther said, everyone has to do their own believing. And we can pray for people, we can point them to Jesus, we can show them Jesus in our own lives, and they still are not going to respond. But you know what? That is not our fault. And so we can't take responsibility on ourselves for someone else's decision. That is God's work. And I don't know about you, but that to me is very liberating. Because it reminds me of what I should do, and I will use the word should. But it also reminds me that in the end, it's not my job to actually make someone believe. There is freedom in that. Fourth thing, this is where I want to put most of our remaining time. And that is that Jesus gives us opportunities. And he gives us different kinds of opportunities in different situations. If you've been here since Ash Wednesday, you might recognize this blackboard that was out there. We started filling it in on Ash Wednesday, those of us who were here, along with the people from other area churches. And we had probably about 200 names between the two sides of the blackboard of people whom we and others had committed to pray for, people who didn't know Jesus. And we had committed to pray for them by name between Ash Wednesday and Easter. I have to say, I'm struck by the name Cheryl there. I'm assuming that's not my wife. I think Rich was on there someplace, maybe on the other side. I kind of get that one. People might have wonders about me. But anyway, these were folks whom we and others who are here and have been here since know who don't know Jesus, and we were committed to praying for them. We were committing to pray for them. Which brings us to the acronym that I've shared with you before, but I'm going to remind us of it again because it's an easy acronym to remember. It's also an easy one, frankly, to forget. And it's one that we use in the covenant to encourage ourselves to be a part of God's work of bringing people to himself. It's the acronym BLESS. And it's very simple. The B is begin with prayer. Begin with prayer. Again, you and I are never going to convince someone that they should follow Jesus. Or as a friend of mine used to say, you're never going to argue someone into the kingdom. But we can pray for them. And the reality is that since it is God's work in the end to turn hearts back toward him, we better be praying. That's the least we can do. That's the least we can do. We may not have other opportunities, but we can be praying for people. Second, listen with care. That's the L. One of the dangers sometimes in our desire to reach people for Christ is we see people as projects. You know, I have this list of people that I want to see come to know Christ. I want to see come to know Christ. There we go. I think I got that out right. And we kind of have this list. It's like, okay, well, when Joe comes to Christ, then I could cross him off the list and I move on to Mary or move on to whoever else. People are not projects. People are people. And the people we know who don't know Jesus, whether they're coworkers or family members or neighbors across the fence or across the hallway, they are people just like us with hopes and hurts and struggles and joys and experiences. And one of the best ways to not treat them as projects is to learn to listen. And to listen especially when they are going through perhaps something significant in their life. The E, I suppose depending on who you are, this might be your favorite one, eat together. Both E and L are about relationships. They're about friendships. In Scripture, eating is about far more than just taking in nourishment. And we know that in our own lives. You know, some of the most important conversations that we can have sometimes happen over a meal. Or some of the most relaxed conversations. Or the most important conversations. And sometimes even the most intense conversations. And it doesn't have to be a meal, but the point is finding places where we can connect with each other and build that friendship, build that relationship. Serve with love. That's the first S. I reminded us last week that discipleship is servant-minded. It's about seeking someone else's highest good. That's why listening comes into play. That's why relationships come into play, because it's pretty hard to serve someone if you don't know what's going on. We could serve people in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's a simple way. It's jotting them a note, sending them a text, maybe making a phone call to encourage them or to thank them. I said this before, you never know when one of those notes might hit someone just when they need it most. It might be watching somebody's kids for an evening so they can get a break. It might be painting someone's fence or washing their windows. It can be any number of things. And again, we don't serve them with any ulterior motive other than to just love on them because they're people created in God's image, deeply loved by Him, and sought after by Jesus Christ. And then the last S, and this is probably the scariest one for a lot of us, and I understand that, is sharing our story. Every one of us has a story. Some of our stories of God's work in our lives are dramatic. Some of them are boring. And frankly, boring ones are probably in many ways better than the dramatic ones. But every one of us has some story to tell about how God has worked in our life or met us at a particular point in life. That if the relationship is there and the opportunity presents itself, can be told. Again, with the point of pointing them to Jesus. In the end, it kind of comes down to this. That in the end, when we've done those things, as God gives us opportunity to do them, there's no greater joy than to see God work through us. Jesus gave the disciples opportunity to go out and to teach and to heal. And then they come back and report. You might have noticed that hopefully you noticed that when I read, we skipped from verse 13 down to verse 30. In between there is the story of John the Baptist's death. It's what we often call a Markan sandwich, where Mark will write about something, then he throws something else. You got one slice of bread, and then he throws something else in there that's not bread, that's something completely different. But then he comes back to something else, and he closes the loop. And when we get from verse 13, and then we go to verse 30, he closes the loop. And he says that after all this, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Jesus gave them opportunities to do what they did. They pursued those opportunities with good results. What's that got to do with us? How does it relate to this issue of joy? I realize not all of us have had this experience, and not all of us will have this experience. But I will never forget the first time I held our daughter when she was just a few minutes old. And if you've ever held your newborn child, you know what an overwhelming thrill it is. And how your heart kind of leaps inside of you. Birth is a miracle. Rebirth is just as much of a miracle, if not more of a miracle. Luke 15 tells us that there is rejoicing in heaven when even one person comes to faith. One person. My hope is that over the years ahead, we are going to have more than one opportunity to have the thrill of seeing people joining us at this table, not because they've come from some other church, but because they have come to Jesus. And because we have, in a sense, been one way or another part of that rebirth for them. And that we will be able to rejoice in seeing what God has done and continues to do, not only in us, but through us. We say we're about going and loving and living. The first word is go. But it could just as well be bless. And the question is this: who are you seeking to bless? Who am I seeking to bless? Who might we bless in the future so that they can join us here as well?